The joke was over. The brand kept talking. This is brand damage. I assumed this was some fresh, deranged copy decision Frida had just made in the last 5 minutes. Then I pulled out an old box of windy sticks from when my first baby was little, looked at the packaging, and realized that the same weird line was already there almost 3 years ago. Which is somehow worse, because now the story is not just, wow, Frida recently made a terrible branding choice. Now the story is, this language was already sitting there in plain sight, and most of us either did not notice it, did not fully clock it, or gave it far more grace than it ever deserved until the culture shifted. Everybody looked again, and suddenly the whole thing made people feel sick. And that is what I want to talk about in this episode. Not just the Frida backlash itself, but the much more interesting question beneath it. How does a brand get away with a certain tone for years, then suddenly have that exact same tone start reading as creepy, contaminated, and completely intolerable? Because that is what happened here. The copy didn't change, the culture did. And Frida somehow did not seem to notice that the room had changed until the audience was already recoiling. Now, to be fair, Frida has never been trying to be some soft, sterile, precious baby brand. That has never been the lane. Their entire brand voice has long been built around being cheeky, blunt, body honest, anti precious, a little gross, mildly taboo breaking, and kind of smugly delighted to say things other motherhood and baby brands won't say. And in some categories, honestly, that worked. Postpartum products for grown women, fine. Fertility products, great. Body products for adults where the whole point is to talk candidly about mess, discomfort, bleeding, leaking, gas, all the things the maternal industrial complex usually wants to package in euphemism and pastel lies. Fine. There is absolutely a lane for irreverent, body forward, slightly inappropriate humor when the product is for grown adults dealing with grown adult realities and grown adult problems. That in itself is not crazy. The problem is that not every brand voice belongs in every aisle. And that is where Frida stepped directly on its own throat. Once that same cheeky, innuendo heavy, aren't we naughty for saying this tone starts showing up on literal baby products, especially baby hygiene products, especially products involving infants' bodies, the whole thing changes. It stops reading as candid. It stops reading as funny. It stops even reading as merely gross. And it starts reading as weird, then creepy, then sinister. And yes, I am going to say it plainly. If you are selling a baby product that, for example, literally gets inserted into a baby's rectum for gas relief, and your package is making sexualized butt jokes, that is insane. That is insane on its face. And in retrospect, it is astounding that this ever made it through review in the first place. But what is almost more interesting than the copy itself is the fact that so many people did not really notice it until now. Or at least they didn't notice it in a way that set off alarm bells. And I think that's because brands often get more grace than they deserve until the culture gives people a reason to look at them differently. Sometimes the brand doesn't change. Sometimes the audience's eyes change. That's a huge part of this story. Because if you're a new parent, as I was, sleep deprived, postpartum, running on fumes, just trying to figure out why your baby is screaming and whether this weird little gas relief thing might actually help, you are not necessarily doing a close textual analysis of every line on the box. You are buying for function. You are exhausted. You are not standing in the aisle going, interesting. Let us pause and examine the semiotics of this copy strategy. You are trying to survive. And because Frida had already coded itself as this kind of irreverent, wink wink, body honest brand, a lot of people probably just absorbed the tone as part of the environment. It was already framed as cheeky, so it got read as cheeky, or at least overlooked as cheeky. And that's actually one of the most interesting things about branding in general. People do not pay attention to your tone of voice with equal intensity at all times. Most customers are not sitting there doing a full semiotic analysis of your packaging while they're trying to get through Target with a baby screaming in the cart and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. They are scanning for utility, price, familiarity, maybe vibes if they have the emotional energy for vibes that day. Which means a brand can get away with something weird for a surprisingly long time if the consumer has no immediate reason to stop and really look at it. And once the consumer finally does stop and look, and really look, the entire tone can flip overnight. That's the danger. A joke that lived harmlessly in the background for years can suddenly become the only thing people see. And once that happens, you do not get to say, well, it was always there. Yes, that's the problem. It was always there, and now people can see it. And culture has a long history of doing this with weird things around children, frankly. Not exactly this, but adjacent to this. We have normalized all sorts of weird child adjacent nonsense for years and years and years, and then suddenly acted shocked once the discomfort became impossible to unsee. Think about how long people watched things like toddlers and tiaras and felt vaguely uncomfortable, but also kept watching. Think about the long arc of child celebrity culture where everyone somehow knows a system is weird and exploitative, but often does not fully break from it until much later. Think about how many disturbing things society can half notice until the right moment hits and suddenly everyone sees them all at once. That's what happened here. And the context shift matters. This is not just some random case of the internet deciding to be mad for sport. Public sensitivity around children, exploitation, sexualization, grooming, elite perversion, institutional cover ups, and all things in that general orbit had already been rising. The public mood had changed. The emotional climate had changed. Online conversation had changed. And whether people had every detail right or not, whether every theory online was sound or not, whether every viral post was wise or not, none of that changes the strategic point. The room had changed. And if you are a brand with a long history of cheeky language and baby product lines, and you are even vaguely paying attention to the public atmosphere, that should have triggered an immediate internal audit. Not because humor is bad, not because all risk is even bad, not because your whole tone of voice has to die, but because category matters. That is the key point. It is fine to get cute with adult fertility products. It is fine to get a little cheeky with postpartum recovery language for grown women. It is fine to use sex jokes or body jokes or transgressive language when the product category actually supports that kind of humor. But it is not fine to keep doing the same thing when you are selling products for literal babies. That is where the failure becomes not just one bad line, but category blindness. The problem was not humor, it was category blindness. And category blindness is one of the easiest ways for a brand to poison itself. Once a brand finds a voice that works somewhere, there's a temptation to flatten that voice across everything. Same tone, same jokes, same smug little wink, same this is who we are energy no matter what aisle you're standing in. But consumers do not experience categories the way brand teams do. To the brand, it's all one portfolio. To the customer, a postpartum recovery product for grown women lives in one moral and emotional universe. A baby gas relief tool lives in another. A fertility joke for adults might feel edgy, candid, or even funny. An innuendo heavy joke around products for literal infants lands completely differently because the customer is not just hearing the joke, They are hearing what kind of judgment the brand seems to have about where joking stops. And if the answer appears to be nowhere, that becomes a trust problem. Now the customer isn't just thinking, that was a weird line. They're thinking, who approved this? Who thought this was normal? What else do these people think is acceptable? That is when a copy problem becomes a credibility problem. And I think that's what makes this such a fascinating brand case, because Frida had built a tone of voice that probably did help differentiate it in parts of the market. They were not wrong that there was a consumer appetite for candor, irreverence, and body realism. A lot of motherhood and babyhood branding is so aggressively sanitized and sentimental that a brand willing to say something gross or blunt could absolutely stand out. But once you carry that tone too far into the wrong category, you are no longer edgy. You are just failing basic judgment. And what really sends me over the edge here is that this was fixable, very fixable. One level of failure is okay, maybe somehow insanely you did not anticipate that this copy was going to become a problem in this cultural climate. Fine. That's already stupid, but let's be charitable for 1 second. The larger failure is that people started telling you, not just on packaging discourse threads, on social media, in comments, in reaction posts, in the actual live feedback loop where modern brands are supposed to be paying attention. People started saying very clearly, this is weird. This is creepy. This does not read right. Why are you talking like this on a baby product? And the brand did not appear to do anything meaningful quickly enough. This is what makes this feel like a brand damage episode instead of just a cringe screenshot. Once people start seeing your baby brand as weirdly sexualizing children, call a meeting immediately. Not next quarter, not after a few more campaigns, not after legal finishes pretending this is survivable. Immediately. Whoever's in charge of social, whoever is in charge of packaging, whoever's in charge of brand voice, whoever's in charge of approvals, sit them down and ask one very simple question. Why are we still talking like this in the baby category? Because the thing about all of this is Frida did not need to stop being funny. That's the really maddening part. Funny baby branding is absolutely possible. You can do blowout jokes, sleep deprivation jokes, chaos jokes, gas jokes, exhausted parent jokes, nothing in this house smells right anymore jokes, your baby is a tiny tyrant with a digestive agenda jokes. There are countless ways to be cheeky and memorable and parent humorous without sounding like somebody's deeply inappropriate group text leaked onto the side of an infant hygiene product. This was not a creativity problem. It was a judgment problem. And it is also a good reminder that brand tone is never universal. A voice that works beautifully in one category can become catastrophic in another. Not every brand voice belongs in every aisle. That should be obvious. And yet, here we are. And the frustrating thing is that this was so fixable. Frida did not need to become bland. They did not need to become one of those sterile baby brands that speaks like a pastel brochure written by a committee. They could have kept the irreverence. They just needed to separate irreverent from inappropriate. That is a real distinction. You can be funny about blowouts, sleep deprivation, gas, parenting chaos, the total indignity of raising tiny humans. Parents are already primed for that humor because it reflects the actual absurdity of their lives. What they are not looking for is a brand that seems unable to tell the difference between bodily humor and sexualized innuendo when babies are involved. That is where the trust starts to break, because once a parent feels like your judgment is off in that category, you do not just lose a laugh, You lose the sense that the brand understands where the line is. And for a baby brand, that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. What Frida should have done was straightforward. First, audit every single baby product line for innuendo, sexualized humor, and anything that could plausibly now read as creepy in the current climate. Second, separate the adult product voice from the baby product voice. If you want to stay edgy and cheeky in adult categories, fine. But stop pretending one tone system should govern everything from fertility to baby gas relief. Third, respond publicly and quickly, not with some defensive non apology nonsense, but with actual recognition that people were uncomfortable. People were pissed, that the discomfort made sense, and that the language was being changed. Fourth, prove that the correction is real. Packaging, social captions, product copy, campaign voice, all of it. The audience is often more forgiving than brands deserve when they can see the brand actually understands what went wrong. And that is what makes Frida's handling of this so stupid. They had more grace than they had any business having. That copy was apparently already there. People missed it, glossed over it, or gave it a pass. I missed it. They were ahead. They got years of tolerance they probably did not deserve. And instead of realizing that and quietly updating the child line packaging before the culture fully turned on them, they just kept going, which is such a self own. They could have gotten away with the pivot. They could have retired the copy and moved on. They could have been the brand that said, okay, fair enough. We pushed too far in this category. Instead, they let the internet arrive at the conclusion that the company making products for babies had somehow built an entire tonal approach around not understanding where the line was anymore. That is not where you want to be as a baby brand. And again, the most interesting part of this whole thing is not even that the language was bad. It is that the language aged into scandal. That's the piece that turns this from simple outrage bait into an actual reputational case study. So, brands love to think that their tone is timeless, that if a joke worked once, it will work forever, that if something didn't cause backlash at launch, it must be fine indefinitely. That is not how culture works. Culture reclassifies things. A joke can go from cheeky to stale, from edgy to try hard, from harmless to contaminated. And once that happens, the brand has two options: notice or get dragged. Frida got dragged. And they got dragged because the audience had stopped laughing long before the brand stopped talking. The copy didn't change, the culture did. And Frida failed to realize they were standing directly in the path of that shift. That is the lesson here. The problem was not that the internet randomly decided to be offended one day. The problem was that a brand built around, we say the gross thing out loud, never seemed to understand that there are some categories where the gross thing cannot also be the weirdly sexual thing. Not anymore. Maybe never should have been. Once people start calling your baby copy creepy, the joke is over. Call a meeting. The joke did not survive the moment, and the brand was too slow to notice the audience had stopped laughing. I'm Krystina Repucci, and this is Brand Damage. Until next time.